Qingui sold herself to pay for her father's burial, fetching no more than the cost of a simple wooden coffin. The first madam, pleased to have struck a bargain, overlooked the old saying, "Cheap things seldom bring good fortune." In the darkness, Qingui was dozing off when Madame Wu's sharp shout jolted her awake. "You lazy girl, wake up and light the lamp." Before she could respond, a string of something came hurtling her way. Qingui instinctively ducked, narrowly avoiding the object. It was the same every night. She had grown used to it. Qingui hurried to light the lamp and saw that the object thrown at her, Buddhist prayer beads, were now scattered across the floor. The elderly madam, holding her embroidered pouch, glared at her in fury and cursed. "You useless, stupid girl. You're so greedy for sleep that I have to wake you every night. If you keep being this dull-witted, don't blame me if I sell you to a brothel." Terrified, Qingui didn't dare delay. She grabbed a towel and a basin from the outer room and rushed to the kitchen to boil water. But she was so drowsy that as she added firewood to the stove, she dozed off again. She only woke up when the rooster crowed in the courtyard. Panicked, she quickly poured the hot water into the basin and carried it to the old lady's room. But the scene inside the room froze her in her tracks. The basin slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor as she let out a horrified scream. The elderly madam was dead. The Wu household was thrown into chaos. After a beating, Qingui was ordered to kneel before the coffin and keep vigil for the deceased. When the master of the house, the old madam's son, returned from the provincial capital, he rushed straight to the mourning hall, clutching the coffin and wailing, "Mother, how could you leave me like this?" Hearing his cries, everyone in the household knelt. "How did my mother die?" the master demanded, his eyes blazing. The first madam trembled as she pointed at Qingui, who was still kneeling. "You wretched girl, speak up and answer the master." Pressing her forehead to the ground, Qingui recounted everything in a trembling voice. The old madam accidentally stepped on the prayer beads that had fallen to the floor, hit her head on the edge of the stool, and passed away. How did the prayer beads end up on the floor? The old madam used them every night for counting. Over time, the string must have worn out. "And where were you? What were you doing?" "I had gone to fetch water for the old madam's wash. By the time I returned," unable to continue, Qingui burst into sobs, her head still pressed to the ground. "Fine," the master spat. "If that's the case, I'll have you buried with her." "Master, that's unwise. The government is cracking down on such practices. If word gets out that a girl was buried alive, it might bring legal trouble. That would be a much greater disaster." The first madam knew her husband hated hearing anything ominous, so she deliberately left her sentence unfinished. The master's face turned ashen. He glared fiercely at Qingui, still trembling on the ground, before turning back to the coffin to resume mourning his mother. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, knowing the crisis had passed. The first madam, understanding her husband's tacit approval, felt a wave of relief and secret delight. Though the Wu family was wealthy, most of their funds were tied up in business ventures. With so many people to feed and clothe, the household expenses were tightly managed by the first madam. Qingui had only been purchased 3 months prior, and losing her to burial rights would mean wasting that money. The girl had sold herself at the gates of the Wu household to pay for her father's burial, asking for a pitifully low price. The first madam, ever shrewd and calculating, felt it was a deal too good to pass up. She had taken Qingui in and promptly found an excuse to dismiss the old madam's former maid. Though outwardly respectful to her mother-in-law, the first madam had long grown weary of the meddling old woman. The Wu family belonged to the first madam and her husband, yet the old madam's presence kept her from taking full control. This fueled the first madam's resentment. The maid who had served the old madam was another thorn in her side, wielding her position to lord over the other servants, including those of the first madam. But what enraged the first madam most was the maid's audacity to flirt with her husband while delivering the old madam's daily greetings. Who does she think she is? The first madam decided to rid herself of this nuisance once and for all. She seized the opportunity to assert her authority under the guise of replacing the old madam's servant. To achieve this, she accused the maid of theft, fabricated evidence that she had tampered with the old madam's medicine for profit, and staged a compromising encounter between her and an outside stable boy. It took every trick in the book, but the first madam finally succeeded in having the maid dismissed with her husband's furious consent. In her place, she installed Qingui. Though Qingui was obedient, she was clumsy to a fault. Tasks always ended in mishaps, and her lack of awareness often invited scolding. It seemed the saying, "cheap things seldom bring good fortune," was proving true. Yet the first madam couldn't have been more pleased. She relished watching Qingui's fumbling attempts to serve the old madam, which often left the latter furious. Whenever the household echoed with the old madam's sharp reprimands for Qingui, the first madam felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. More importantly, Qingui's simple-mindedness was a guarantee. The girl would never harbor ambitious thoughts, especially toward the master of the house. That, above all, put the first madam at ease. The old madam's funeral was lavish, attended by all the county's notable officials and gentry. At the master's request, the government even erected a chastity archway in her honor. For 50 years, the old madam had lived as a widow. Every night, she scattered the copper coins from her embroidered pouch onto the ground, groping in the dark to retrieve them one by one until dawn. Not a single coin was ever left behind. For the master, those polished copper coins were proof enough that his mother deserved the archway. After the grand funeral, Qingui was summoned to kneel before the first madam, awaiting reassignment. "Qingui, take this as a lesson. If you mess up again, even I won't be able to save you. Thank you, madam, for sparing my life. I promise to serve you faithfully from now on." The girl kowtowed fervently, her forehead thudding against the floor. The first madam chuckled to herself. Watching Qingui's earnest but foolish demeanor, she thought, is her head made of wood? Doesn't she feel pain? All right, that's enough. Get up. I have new instructions for you. Qingui sprang to her feet, her forehead visibly bruised. From now on, you'll serve the third madam. She's expecting a child, so you must take extra care. Yes, madam. With that, Qingui turned and left, presumably heading to the third madam's quarters. The first madam's maid, Chana, frowned at Qingui's unceremonious departure and moved to correct her lack of decorum. But the first madam stopped her with a tug and a knowing smile. "It's better this way. Let her stay foolish." Unaware of the exchange behind her, Qingui walked off with a spring in her step. For the first time, she felt happy, relieved that she no longer had to kneel in the dark every night, enduring the old madam's scolding while bracing for her unpredictable demands. She thought, maybe now I can finally get a good night's sleep in the third madam's quarters. What bad luck, sending a servant who attended the dead to my quarters. What is the meaning of this? The third madam glared at Qingui, who stood silently at the door. Her anger flared as she refused to let the girl in. "Madam, please don't get upset in your condition. Since the order came from the first madam, you can't reject it. It's a gift, and you must accept it. It's also a sign of the master's care for you." The maid, Pinger, glanced meaningfully at the third madam and discreetly pinched her arm to warn her not to speak recklessly. Realizing her earlier outburst had been unwise, the third madam shifted uneasily and cast another glance at Qingui, who remained motionless at the door, her head bowed. Pinger leaned closer to whisper in her ear. After a moment, the third madam nodded and shouted at Qingui, still standing outside. "From now on, you're in charge of cleaning the courtyard. Without my explicit orders, you're not allowed to step into my room. Now go." Qingui nodded and walked away, her gait as stiff as her expression. "Doesn't that girl seem a bit dim?" the third madam remarked. "Her foolishness is a blessing, madam. At least she didn't stir up trouble with what you just said." If the first madam had sent someone scheming and clever, you'd be shedding tears right now. Pinger's analysis was thorough, causing the third madam to inhale sharply and nod in agreement. The third madam's arrogance was not without reason. Her swelling belly commanded respect throughout the household. Everyone, regardless of rank, deferred to her. The first madam, having borne only a daughter who was away at school in the provincial capital, lacked the leverage an heir could provide. The second madam, though married into the family for years, had no children and had grown plump from years of herbal remedies. But the third madam had proven to be different. Not long after entering the household, she became pregnant. The master pinned all his hopes on the child she was carrying, granting her every indulgence. Whenever he returned from the provincial capital, he spent most of his time in her quarters. Though Qingui was clumsy, she was diligent. She took great pleasure in tending to the courtyard, sweeping and scrubbing tirelessly. The work was not difficult for her, and even after completing her tasks, she often felt she had energy to spare. She began nurturing the neglected flowers and plants in the courtyard, meticulously pruning, loosening the soil, and watering them. Before long, the plants began to thrive under her care, bursting into vibrant greenery and spectacular blooms. This foolish girl has quite the knack for tending flowers. I've never seen them bloom so beautifully since I moved into this courtyard. The third madam mused aloud as she gazed at the flourishing plants from her window. Because of her pregnancy, the first madam had forbidden her from going out, emphasizing the importance of safeguarding her health. The master had also been absent, tied up with business in the provincial capital. The days of confinement left the third madam feeling irritable and stifled. But the sight of the blooming flowers outside her window that day lifted her spirits. "Pinger, help me out to the courtyard. I want to see the flowers up close." "Madam, please wait a moment. I'll fetch a shawl for you. The weather in March is unpredictable. You mustn't catch a chill." Pinger went to the inner room to retrieve a shawl, but the third madam grew impatient. She stepped over the threshold and made her way toward the flowers. Before she could reach them, her foot slipped. She fell heavily to the ground. When Qingui returned with a yoke of water buckets slung over her shoulders, she found the courtyard already in chaos. The first madam rushed out of her room, pale with worry, shouting at the servants. "Why isn't the doctor here yet? Go and summon him again, hurry." Setting down her buckets, Qingui approached a nearby servant and whispered, "What happened?" The third madam fell. "She's bleeding. The child might be." Before the servant could finish, Qingui's heart sank. Foolish as she was, even she understood the gravity of losing this child, the master's greatest hope. The doctor finally arrived and stayed in the room for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the sound of the third madam's heart-wrenching sobs pierced the air. The doctor emerged slowly, clutching his medicine bag. He sighed deeply and left without a word. Pinger bore the brunt of the blame. The first madam slapped her several times, leaving her kneeling on the ground, crying and pleading for mercy. "Qingui! Qingui!" Hearing the first madam's sharp call, Qingui hastened to the door and answered timidly, not daring to step inside. "Come in, quickly," the first madam snapped impatiently. "I dare not," Qingui murmured. "And why not?" The third madam instructed that without her permission, I must not enter her room. "Well, now I'm instructing you to enter. Stop dawdling and get in here." Still, Qingui remained rooted to the spot. The first madam chuckled bitterly and turned to the third madam, who was lying weakly on the bed. "Sister, it seems Qingui listens to you, and only you now. Even I can't get her to obey. Why don't you give her permission to enter?" "You wretched girl! Why are you still standing there? Get in here!" the third madam shouted through her tears. Only then did Qingui hurry inside, stopping by the bed. The first madam handed her a packet of medicine. "Go and brew this immediately." Qingui nodded and sprinted to the kitchen with the medicine. The kitchen was deserted, as it was long after lunch. Qingui found a pot, opened the medicine packet, and dumped all the herbs in at once. She added water and set it on the stove to boil. That's not how you brew medicine. The herbs need to go in at different stages. A male voice suddenly spoke from behind her, startling her. Turning, she saw it was Wu Huai, the master's adopted son. "Good day, young master." Qingui greeted him hastily, standing at attention. Though Wu Huai lived in the household, his courtyard was tucked away at the farthest corner, and he rarely made an appearance. Pale and thin, he leaned on a crutch with one hand while holding a clay pot with the other. Qingui felt uneasy. She had always brewed medicine this way, having never been told otherwise. She was too timid to ask for guidance, even when preparing the old madam's remedies. Wu Huai, noticing her uncertainty, set his own pot aside and used chopsticks to sift through the herbs in Qingui's pot. He removed a few and placed them to the side. "Let this batch boil for half an hour first. Then add these herbs and let it simmer on low heat," he instructed. Qingui nodded quickly and followed his directions. Once the medicine was settled, Qingui glanced at Wu Huai and noticed he was brewing a pot of medicine for himself. "Young master, shall I help you with that?" "No need. I've always done it myself," he replied flatly, declining her offer. Not daring to say more, Qingui returned to her task. When the medicine was ready, she brought it to the third madam's bedside. By then, the first madam had already left. The third madam lay dazed, her face streaked with dried tears. Pinga was nowhere to be seen, leaving Qingui to speak softly. "Madam, the medicine is ready. Please take a little." But the third madam suddenly erupted in fury, leaping up and smashing the bowl of medicine against the wall. The ceramic shattered into pieces. "What's the point of drinking this now? I might as well be dead. My child, my child." She broke down into wailing sobs. Qingui had no words to console her. She bent down silently, picking up the fragments, lamenting the wasted medicine in her heart. The first madam sent a messenger to inform the master about what had happened, expecting him to return quickly. However, there was no response from him. Uneasy, she asked around and discovered that the master was facing business troubles and was too preoccupied with managing his connections to worry about matters at home. Since the master was ignoring the situation, the first madam decided the third madam's issues weren't worth fretting over either. After a few perfunctory visits to console her, she stopped coming altogether. Pinger, who had been confined for 3 days, was finally released. This pleased Qingui, as she no longer had to face the daunting task of trying to placate the third madam on her own. To avoid triggering the third madam's grief, Qingui personally uprooted all the flowers she had planted, clearing the courtyard until not even a blade of grass was left. As she carried the uprooted flowers away, she ran into Wu Huai, who was on his way to the kitchen to brew medicine. He looked at the flowers in her arms and asked, surprised, "Why are you getting rid of these? They were blooming so beautifully." "They were blooming where they shouldn't. They had to go," Qingui replied. "The flowers are innocent. That's too harsh. How about this? Could you help me replant them in my courtyard instead?" Qingui glanced at Wu Huai, then at the flowers in her arms. After a moment, she nodded and followed him to his quarters. Wu Huai's courtyard was stark and quiet. He had no servants, preferring to live alone, which made the space feel large and empty. "Where should I plant them?" Qingui asked. "Over there," Wu Huai said, pointing to the edge of the courtyard near the wall. Qingui looked up at the sun and shook her head. "That spot's too shaded. The flowers won't grow well there. They should go in the middle of the courtyard." She pointed to the sunlit center. "All right, let's do it your way," Wu Huai agreed without hesitation. Within moments, Qingui had deftly replanted the flowers. The once barren courtyard was now full of life. "Thank you. You've transformed my courtyard," Wu Huai said politely. Embarrassed, Qingui shook her head and quickly left. After all, the household had many watchful eyes, and lingering too long in Wu Huai's courtyard wouldn't be appropriate. When she returned to the third madam's courtyard, she found someone standing in the middle of it, a maid named Lian Cui, who served the second madam. It seemed the second madam had come to visit. Qingwei cast Lian Cui a quick glance before lowering her head and hurrying past her. She avoided conversations with others, unsure of how to navigate polite small talk. Lian Cui turned to watch Qingwei's retreating figure, thinking, so that's the new dim-witted maid I've heard about. She didn't give it much thought, fanning herself casually as she waited for the second madam to come out. Inside, Qingwei sat by the window, looking out at Lian Cui. She let out a soft sigh. The third madam suddenly began to show signs of madness. She refused to sleep at night, alternately crying and laughing. At times, she claimed she could hear her child calling out to her, and at others, she insisted the old madam's voice was speaking to her from beyond the grave. Initially, everyone thought her frail body was causing hallucinations, but 2 days later, even Pinger, who slept by her side, claimed to have heard terrifying sounds in the middle of the night. The noises were eerie and piercing, like cries from the underworld. Rumors of haunting in the third madam's courtyard quickly spread through the household, leaving everyone in a state of panic. No one dared to enter the courtyard unless absolutely necessary, fearing they might encounter something unclean. While others could avoid the courtyard, the first madam could not. After questioning Pinger, she summoned Qingwei. Have you heard any strange noises in your courtyard at night? No, I haven't, Qingwei replied honestly. But both the third madam and Pinger say they heard loud noises. How come you didn't hear anything? I don't know. Maybe it's because I sleep too soundly. I don't even hear the third madams crying and laughing at night. I only find out about it the next morning, Qingwei admitted. You're something else, aren't you? Sleeping like a log even in times like this? You need to be more vigilant. The first madam was torn between laughing and scolding at Qingwei's straightforwardness. She couldn't determine whether the third madam was causing a fuss on purpose to manipulate the situation, or if there truly was something supernatural at play. Pinger's words were only half believable. After all, she was loyal to the third madam, and the two might have concocted a scheme. Qingwei, on the other hand, seemed trustworthy in her sincerity, but her dim-wittedness made it impossible to glean more useful information from her. Do you think the third madam might be stirring up trouble to get the master to come home so she can complain? The first madam asked her maid, Chonner. Madam, it's not out of the question. Ever since her miscarriage, the master hasn't paid her any attention. He hasn't returned even once, Chonner replied. That sly little fox. But no matter her intentions, we need to resolve this. Didn't you send Qingwei back to keep watch at night? That dim-witted girl doesn't exactly inspire confidence, but we don't have any better options right now. The following night, the first madam was abruptly awakened by frantic knocking on her door. It was Qingwei, clutching a large shoe in her arms. Madam, I saw the ghost, Qingwei exclaimed breathlessly as she burst into the room. The first madam was startled. She quickly threw on a robe and demanded, A ghost? Where? It climbed over the wall and ran away. I tried to chase it but couldn't catch up. But this is what it left behind, Qingwei said, panting. The first madam looked closely. It was an embroidered shoe, but it was far too large, more suited to a man's foot than a woman's. It was clear that someone had been pretending to be a ghost. Which direction did it go? Chonner asked from the side. That way, Qingwei replied, pointing toward the second madam's courtyard. Was it a man or a woman? Did you see clearly? It was too dark to tell, but the figure was wearing clothes like ours, Qingwei said, frowning as she tried to recall the details. The first madam pondered for a moment, then instructed Chonner, gather everyone in the household and have them report to the main hall immediately. No one is to be absent. Soon, everyone in the household, including Wu Huai, was assembled in the main hall. The third madam, pale and trembling, sat next to the first madam with Pinger supporting her. Did you hear the sounds again tonight? The first madam asked with concern. The third madam nodded weakly, too drained to speak. Madam and I both heard it. As soon as it started, Chingue rushed out, and then the sound stopped. Pinger nervously added. The first madam nodded in satisfaction. Turning to the crowd, she declared, "This ghost has been causing unrest in the household for far too long. Tonight, we will reveal its true identity." With a signal from the first madam, Chana placed the large shoe on the floor for all to see. The gathered servants exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. This shoe was left behind by the ghost in its haste to escape. Now I will use it to unmask the culprit. Every person here must try on this shoe, and we'll see who it fits. The first madam gave Chana another meaningful look. Understanding immediately, Chana began lining everyone up to try on the shoe. The shoe was indeed unusually large. It was far too big for any of the women, and even the men's feet looked small in comparison. When Wu Huai tried it on, he quipped, "Who would believe this is supposed to be a woman's shoe? It's more like a boat." All eyes turned to the second madam, whose face had grown paler by the moment. So pale, in fact, that she looked even worse than the third madam. "What's wrong, sister?" the first madam asked with feigned concern, holding her hand. The second madam weakly shook her head. "I must have gotten up too quickly. I didn't wear enough layers and caught a chill," she said faintly. Before she could finish, she collapsed in a faint. Her maid, Lian Shui, panicked and moved to help her up. "Wait," the first madam ordered, stepping in to block her. "Chana, you and Xingui take the second madam to her room and summon the doctor. As for Lian Shui, you'll stay here and finish trying on the shoe before you leave." Lian Shui froze in place, instinctively tucking her feet beneath her skirt. "Why don't we start with you?" the first madam suggested warmly. "That way, you can get back to your mistress sooner." The crowd parted, leaving a path between Lian Shui and the shoe. She stared at the shoe, but made no move to approach. "What's the matter? Aren't you eager to get back to your mistress?" the first madam asked pointedly. The onlookers turned their attention to Lian Shui, puzzled by her hesitation. It was then that someone with a sharp eye noticed her feet, peeking out from under her skirt, and whispered, "Her feet don't look as dainty as the other maids." The shoe sat quietly on the floor, but to Lian Shui, it was a death sentence. Suddenly, Lian Shui laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. She looked at the first madam coldly and said, "Madam, you are truly cunning." Her gaze shifted to the second madam, who was being carried out of the hall. With a trace of longing, she said, "Second madam, take care. This is as far as I can go with you." Then, without warning, she charged at one of the hall's pillars and smashed her head against it. The sudden turn of events left everyone in the hall stunned. Qinggue, startled by the commotion, turned to look and cried out, "Oh no, Sister Lian Shui." Hearing her exclamation, the second madam regained consciousness just in time to see Lian Shui's lifeless body. She let out a blood-curdling scream before fainting once more. Upon closer inspection, it was confirmed that Lian Shui's foot fit the shoe perfectly. As the household buzzed with whispers, Pingo pointed at Lian Shui's neck in horror and stammered, "Lian Shui, she's a man." All eyes turned to the body, where the high collar Lian Shui usually wore had shifted to reveal a prominent Adam's apple. The second madam's maid had been a man all along. This wasn't merely a case of someone pretending to be a ghost. The second madam was placed under house arrest, awaiting the master's return to decide her fate. She refused to eat or drink, seemingly resigned to her death. The master remained silent, but the first miss suddenly returned from the provincial capital. She wore a Western-style gauzy dress, high-heeled leather shoes, and her hair was styled in large waves, tied with a pink satin ribbon into a big bow above her ear. The sight of her startled the first madam. "What on earth are you wearing? Take it off immediately. If your father sees this, he'll break your legs." "This is the latest fashion in the provincial capital. Father's there all the time. He's not as old-fashioned as you are," the first miss retorted. Spinning in front of the first madam, she let her dress flare out like a blooming trumpet flower. "Mother, isn't it beautiful? You naughty child. I don't know what to do with you, the first madam sighed. But why are you back? It's not the holidays yet, she asked, realizing the timing was odd. I ran out of money. I came back to get more, the first miss replied nonchalantly. Your father's business hasn't been going well lately. You need to be frugal, the first madam admonished. Without asking further, she took out her private stash of silver and handed it to her daughter. This isn't enough, mother, the first miss complained. It's plenty, more than enough for you, the first madam insisted. No, it's really not, she grumbled. Sensing something was amiss, the first madam's tone turned serious. Tell me the truth. What do you need the money for? It's just for my usual expenses, like clothes and such. That's not a big expense. The allowance you get should cover it easily. How could it not be enough? Fearing more questions, the first miss snatched the silver and stomped off to her room in a huff. Bored and restless, she suddenly had an idea. Her eyes lit up as she decided to visit the third madam's courtyard. Tradition dictated that when the first miss returned home, she was supposed to pay respects to the other madams. Normally, she avoided this chore whenever possible. But this time was different. After paying respects, the madams were also expected to reciprocate with gifts, often in the form of silver or other valuables. The second madam was under house arrest, so she didn't need to visit her, but the third madam was still a potential source of profit. With that thought, she leapt to her feet and headed straight to the third madam's courtyard. Qingguo was sweeping the courtyard when the first miss entered. Seeing her, Qingguo froze in awe. You're so beautiful, like a fairy. And your dress, it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Can I touch it? Qingguo's simple-mindedness was on full display. Having arrived in the household only recently, she had never met the first miss before. As for the dress, it was a novelty not just for her, but for everyone in the household. The first miss, unused to receiving genuine praise, felt her vanity swell with satisfaction. Since you have good taste, I'll let you touch it. But wash your hands first. Don't you dare dirty my dress. Qingguo eagerly washed her hands and then returned to gently stroke the edge of the dress. What kind of fabric is this? It's so soft and smooth. It's beautiful. Her fascination made the first miss burst into laughter. Why haven't I seen you before? Are you new? Qingguo nodded, but kept her eyes glued to the dress. Do you know who I am? Qingguo shook her head. Have you heard of the first miss of this household? Qingguo nodded. That's me. Startled, Qingguo stepped back and bowed respectfully. First miss, greetings. Her display of deference greatly pleased the first miss, who gave Qingguo one last glance before striding into the third madam's room. The first miss didn't stay long in the third madam's room. When she emerged, she looked disgruntled, holding a pair of silver earrings in her hand. Ugh, what garbage. Who even wants this junk, she muttered. Seeing her leave, Qingguo quickly bowed to send her off. Annoyed, the first miss took the opportunity to vent. Your mistress is so stingy. She treats silver like gold. Is she trying to insult me? Please don't be upset, first miss. Qingguo said cautiously. Our madam truly doesn't have much to spare. She's not like the others. No matter what, this is just a small token of her appreciation. Please don't take it to heart. The others? Besides my mother, who else is there? The first miss asked. I don't know about the living, but I've heard some things about the late old madam, Qingguo said honestly. When the old madam passed away, the master buried a fortune with her. Even her mouth was stuffed with a solid gold ingot. The first miss's eyes widened with interest. She had never heard of this before. When the old madam died, she had made excuses to avoid returning home. She had disliked her grandmother since childhood. The old madam had never shown her any affection, constantly blaming her for taking the good fortune meant for a brother, which supposedly prevented the first madam from bearing a son. Even her father's attitude toward her had grown distant because of this. She harbored deep resentment toward the old madam and hadn't even wanted to see her one last time. Is that really true? You can ask any servant and they'll tell you. Chingue replied earnestly. That was easy enough for the first Mississippi. By the end of the afternoon, she had pieced together most of the truth. The next morning, she hurriedly bid farewell to the first madam, claiming she needed to return to her studies, and left for the provincial capital. With the first miss gone, the household returned to its usual quiet. The first madam resumed her devotions, praying and burning incense. The second madam, consumed by guilt, spent her days weeping and fasting. The third madam remained frail and dispirited, a shadow of her former self. The only place in the household that seemed to hold any vitality was Wu Huai's courtyard, where the flowers Chingue had planted bloomed brilliantly, bursting with life. I didn't expect them to thrive so well here, Wu Huai said, admiring the blossoms. They're not particularly rare flowers. With sunlight and water, they'll grow, Chingue replied matter-of-factly. That's not always true. In someone else's hands, they might not survive at all. It's not the person, it's the flowers. They choose to live or die on their own. That's where you're wrong. Many things depend on human effort, Wu Huai said with a hint of philosophy. Chingue didn't argue further. To her, planting flowers was a simple task, but Wu Huai always made it sound profound, too deep for her to grasp. After watering the last plant, she said, "Young master, I'm heading back. What if a strong wind comes? What will happen to the flowers then?" Wu Huai asked. "Don't worry. If they want to live, they won't die," she replied. With that, she hoisted her empty buckets and walked leisurely out of the courtyard. The master finally returned, but he was no longer the spirited man he once was. He had been swindled by a supposed merchant from the northeast, resulting in devastating financial losses. The man had come to his shop selling antlers at a price slightly below market value. Since the demand wasn't high, the master only purchased a small quantity. Not long after, rumors spread in the market that someone was buying antlers in bulk at exceptionally high prices. Regretting his earlier caution, the master felt he had missed a great opportunity. Later, at a social gathering with friends, he ran into the same northeastern merchant. Eager to mend his mistake, he used every connection he had to secure another batch of discounted antlers. This time, he made a substantial profit. Having tasted success, he couldn't stop. He approached the merchant again, hoping to buy more antlers at the same low price. However, the merchant, aware of the market's rapid price increase, refused to sell unless the master committed to a bulk order. Blinded by greed, the master used his shops in the provincial capital as collateral and even borrowed from loan sharks to fund the purchase. But just as the shipment arrived, the market price for antlers plummeted. The value halved overnight as the market became flooded with supply. Faced with a dilemma, sell at a significant loss or hold onto the stock and risk further depreciation, the master decided to store the antlers in a rented warehouse, waiting for prices to recover. The warehouse seemed fine at first, but soon after the antlers were stored, it became damp. The entire stock molded and became worthless. Even if given away for free, no one wanted them. The master's decades of savings were wiped out in this single venture. He returned home bedridden, unable to face the world or manage household affairs. Although there was no income left, the household still had many mouths to feed. This left the first madam deeply troubled. After much deliberation, she decided to approach the master. "Master, we won't be able to cover next month's expenses," she said hesitantly. The master lay silent for a long time before responding weakly. "Get rid of the useless people. Sell those with death contracts to make ends meet." With her orders in hand, the first madam set about cutting costs. The first person she chose to sell was the third madam. "You can't do this to me. I belong to the master in life and in death," the third madam protested, distraught. "If you belong to the master, then it's the master who decides your fate. And right now, he's decided to sell you," the first madam retorted coldly. "I don't believe you. I must see the master." The third madam struggled her way to the master's quarters. The first madam didn't stop her, only smirking as she watched her go. Inside, the third madam knelt by the master's bedside. "Master, I don't believe you could be so cruel as to sell me." After a fit of coughing, the master replied feebly, "You couldn't even keep my child safe. What use do I have for you?" Stunned, the third madam froze in disbelief. She couldn't reconcile the man who once lavished her with affection with the one now speaking so callously. "Leave. Stop making a fuss. Do as the first madam says," the master concluded, his voice strained. He waved her away, unwilling to speak further. The first madam entered the room, signaling to two servants to drag the third madam out. She then approached the master's bedside and tucked in his blanket with a feigned tenderness. "The medicine will be ready soon. I'll bring it over shortly," she said softly. Amid the household's chaos, the second madam's courtyard was eerily quiet. Qingwei entered with a bowl of porridge and opened the second madam's door. "Madam, please eat something," she said gently. "Get out. I won't eat." Though weak and barely alive, the second madam mustered all her strength to shout at Qingwei. Qingwei stood awkwardly for a moment, then said, "The household is falling apart. The master is ill. The third madam has been sold, and if you don't eat—" "What did you say? Repeat that." The second madam struggled to sit up, staring intently at Qingwei. Unaware that the second madam had no idea what was happening, Qingwei explained, "Madam, please eat. The household staff will all be dismissed soon. If you don't eat, how will you have the strength to leave? Is what you're saying true?" A flicker of light returned to the second madam's eyes. Qingwei nodded, placing the porridge before her. Suddenly ravenous, the second madam ate every bite. From that day forward, whenever Qingwei brought her meals, she finished them without complaint. Before the first madam could fully settle household matters, news arrived that the old madam's tomb had been robbed. The master, trembling, rushed to the site. All he found was the grave's wide-open entrance and the old madam's corpse discarded on the ground. All the buried treasures were gone. "Who did this?" the master roared at the sky, coughing up blood that splattered across the old madam's tombstone. From that day onward, he grew weaker, hovering on the brink of death. Seeing the family's collapse, the first madam decided to dismiss or sell off everyone remaining in the household, keeping only her maid, Chana, to help care for the master. As Qingwei was under a death contract, she too was slated to be sold. However, the buyer turned out to be none other than Wu Huai. "Madam, please sell her to me," Wu Huai said. "You?" The first madam was astonished. She hadn't expected the buyer to be the master's adopted son. "Yes. I'm not only buying her, I also want to purchase the courtyard I live in," Wu Huai replied, placing a silver note in front of the first madam. The first madam's face lit up at the amount. Pulling Qingwei forward, she said, "You're truly a fool with good fortune. Hurry and thank the young master." Qingwei bowed clumsily, expressing her gratitude, and followed Wu Huai to his courtyard. "Look at how well these flowers are blooming," Wu Huai remarked to Qingwei. She nodded but said nothing. "You don't have to hold back around me. Be yourself," he said, smiling. Surprised, Qingwei glanced at him, her expression softening. Wu Huai looked up at the bright moon above and suggested, "The moonlight is beautiful tonight. Why don't we sit and chat?" "I'm a simple person, young master. I wouldn't know what to say," she replied. "Then let's talk about everything that's happened over the past days," Wu Huai said with a gentle smile. Under the moonlight, the first madam quietly opened the door to the second madam's room. "Sister, are you asleep? You've finally come. Can I leave now?" "You're dreaming. Why would I let you leave? Why won't you let me go? Isn't everyone else being allowed to leave?" "Everyone but you," the first madam said coldly. "Why? After all these years, do you still hate me this much? Since I became the second madam, I've never competed for the master's favor, and I didn't even dare to have children. Can't you forgive me?" "Forgive you? How could I forgive you?" You were my maid, my dowry servant, and yet overnight, you became the second madam. How can I forgive such humiliation? The first madam's voice trembled with rage. You love the master and you love this house, don't you? Then stay here and keep being the second madam. Stay by the master's side with me. You're not going anywhere. You venomous woman, the second madam shouted, losing control. Venomous? Oh, this is just the beginning. Do you want to know what I did with the body of your lover, Lien Chui? What did you do to him? The second madam asked, her voice trembling. Naturally, I had him wrapped in a mat and thrown into the mass graveyard to feed the wild dogs. The next day, I even sent someone to check. Oh, it was a gruesome sight. The first madam let out a triumphant laugh, not noticing the second madam pulling a pair of scissors from her hiding place and lunging toward her. Why do you suspect me? Qingui asked coldly, staring at Wu Huai. I carefully examined the prayer beads scattered on the floor next to the old madam. Those beads had been in her hands for years. They couldn't possibly have looked so new. I checked the string's end and found no signs of wear. The cut was clean, as though it had been made with scissors. Hearing this, Qingui smiled. Indeed, the string on the floor was one she had replaced. She had waited for the old madam to throw the beads as usual and switched the string in the dark. When the old woman slipped that night, she hadn't died immediately. Qingui had grabbed a stool and struck her on the back of the head. She deserved to die. The third madam's miscarriage was also your doing, wasn't it? Wu Huai continued. What makes you say that? When you helped me plant flowers, you mentioned that they needed sunlight and shouldn't be placed in shaded areas. But the flowers you planted in the third madam's courtyard were all in partially shaded spots. I suspect your goal wasn't the flowers, but the moss growing beneath them. Her fall was deliberate, wasn't it? Qingui scratched her head and laughed. Young master, your theories sound like stories from a novel. Seeing she wouldn't admit it, Wu Huai pressed on. The embroidered shoe was your doing too, wasn't it? I checked the sole. There was barely anywhere. It was practically new. And when I compared the embroidery to your handiwork in the sewing room, the stitching was identical. Realizing nothing had escaped Wu Huai's notice, Qingui admitted, yes, it was me. I can understand the first two incidents, but why harm Lien Chui? He had nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me? Qingui suddenly laughed hysterically, tears streaming down her face. Fine. Since you're so interested, let me tell you about my connection to him. Lien Chui's real name was Jiang Shaohai. He was the bookkeeper for my family's business. An orphan, he was taken in by my father and raised as part of our household. My father treated him like a son, and my mother even sewed shoes for him because of his unusually large feet. When I grew older, I practiced sewing by making shoes for him as well. But this trust and kindness led to our ruin. They would never have imagined that Jiang Shaohai would leak our business accounts to Wu Dafu, that beast, leading to the massacre of my entire family. But how did he become the second madam's maid? When the second madam was still a dowry maid, he fell in love with her at first sight. To win her over, he boasted that he was my father's adopted son and would one day inherit the family business. The second madam, driven by vanity, believed him and waited for him to rise to power. But after a few years, his position in our household remained stagnant. Worse, his negligence caused several bad deals, leading my father to lose faith in him. The second madam, terrified of poverty, decided to leave him. Yet Jiang Shaohai was infatuated with her and refused to let go. In desperation, he devised another plan. To elevate her status, he betrayed us, giving our financial records to the second madam. She used this information to gain favor and was eventually elevated from maid to mistress. True to her word, she smuggled Jiang Shaohai into the household disguised as her maid, allowing them to live together as lovers. While they enjoyed their happiness, my family bled to death. Every single one of them, from the youngest to the oldest, was slaughtered, except for me. You're the daughter of the Li family from Linjiang? The sole survivor of that massacre 10 years ago. Wu Huai asked in shock. That's right. But wasn't it reported that bandits were behind the massacre? That was a cover story. The real mastermind was Wu Dafu. I survived because my mother hid me in a dry well in the back courtyard. After the massacre, I overheard Wu Dafu instructing his men to ensure no one escaped, lest they become a threat in the future. By now, Qinggui's eyes were red with suppressed rage. Wu Huai handed her a handkerchief. She refused, her voice steady. You can report me to the authorities now. Why would I do that? All of this is speculation. There's no evidence. We were just chatting, Wu Huai said with a calm smile. Qinggui looked at him, stunned, unable to understand his intent. Since we've discussed your story, let me tell you mine. Everyone knows I'm Wu Dafu's adopted son. He even made me take a surname. But my real name is Wang Huai. Qinggui had heard rumors about Wu Huai's origins, that he was the son of Wu Dafu's sworn brother, who had been killed by mountain bandits during a trip to procure goods. Wu Dafu had reportedly escaped with his life and later adopted his brother's son, raising him generously. Was your father murdered by Wu Dafu as well? Qinggui asked, horrified. Wu Dafu smells profit like a predator smells blood. He killed my father and then adopted me, not out of kindness, but to claim our family's assets. He even tried to force himself on my mother. When she refused, she hanged herself. Before she died, she told me to endure and pretend to know nothing. She made me promise to wait until I was strong enough to avenge her. So, you've been waiting too? Qinggui's tense demeanor softened, a flicker of warmth appearing in her eyes. After so many years, watching Wu Dafu fall into my trap brought a satisfaction only you could understand, Wu Huai said. The antler scam. It was your plan? Qinggui exclaimed, realizing the truth. The failed investment that had accelerated Wu Dafu's downfall was not a twist of fate, but part of Wu Huai's carefully laid scheme. Under the clear, bright moonlight, the two shared a moment of understanding. Someone, bring me water. Wu Dafu's weak voice groaned from his sickbed. A bowl of water was brought to his lips, but when he saw it was his adopted son holding it, he flinched. Where's your godmother? Why isn't she here? The first madam went to see the second madam. She won't be back anytime soon, Qinggui replied, poking her head out from behind Wu Huai. Godfather, weren't you thirsty? Let me help you drink the water, Wu Huai said kindly as he propped Wu Dafu up. Master, was it arsenic or rat poison you had me by today? I can't seem to remember, Qinggui asked, her tone naive and silly. Wu Dafu froze, his entire body tensing. He glanced at the bowl of water, his throat bobbing as he swallowed nervously. Suddenly, I'm not thirsty anymore. Put the water down, he said, forcing a weak smile. Wu Huai nodded, setting the bowl aside without protest, and gently laying Wu Dafu back down. What brings you to my room today? Wu Dafu asked, trying to sound casual. There's something I wanted to report. We've uncovered the truth about the old madam's grave robbery. Whether to apprehend the culprits or not, I'll leave the decision to you, father, Wu Huai replied. Of course, we'll catch them. There's nothing to discuss. Tell me, who did it? It's... Wu Huai hesitated, looking conflicted. Speak up. Wu Dafu snapped, his irritation mounting. Tell me who it was so I can have them torn to pieces. It was the 1st Mississippi. She hired people to do it. What? That wretched girl. Wu Dafu gasped for air, unable to catch his breath. His rage consumed him, and he died on the spot. 5 years later, one evening, Qinggui walked arm in arm with Wang Huai past the Bailman dance hall. On a large poster, the first miss was depicted in a revealing outfit, her face heavily painted with makeup. The text introduced her as a popular dancer, Wu Ruru. Qinggui couldn't help but laugh, recalling the old madam's words all those years ago. If you keep being so useless, I'll sell you to a brothel. Not long after, the county government received an anonymous tip. The report alleged that Wu Dafu's granddaughter was working as a dancer in the provincial capital, a disgraceful act. The report demanded the removal of the old Madame's Chastity Memorial Arch as an example to others. On the day the memorial arch collapsed, Chingue stood among the crowd, laughing.